Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Some Stops Along the Way, your podcast that highlights some of the most interesting countries in the world through the lens of my work there, but also explores their history, their culture, and their geopolitics. We're going to continue with Egypt today, a fascinating country, and our first under the theme of Islam's fault line. This will be our second episode, and I think you'll find it very engaging and informative. But first, I want to remind you on Amazon, my memoir is live, the same uh, title as the podcast. It contains some stories of some very interesting people, some insights of countries around the world where I've worked. I think you'll like it. And also, I have two novels out right now. Um, The Ghost of Mariupol, which I talked about on previous podcasts, which all the sales of this book go to support Ukrainian causes. It's a great story. I think you'll like it. Hope you'll grab a copy on Amazon if you get the chance. And then my newest novel, Chasing Ghost. This is an excellent story of redemption and of courage and sacrifice. I think that you'll like Chasing Ghost very much. It's available on Amazon as well. As a compendium to the episode today on Egypt, there is another book that's available on Amazon that I would encourage you to get your hands on. It's by Jahan Sadat, wife of the late Anwar Sadat, who is president of Egypt. We'll be talking about Sadat today extensively during this podcast. It's called The Woman of Egypt. This is a fantastic book. I've read this so many times and continue to just extrapolate information from it. Jahan Sadat's, you may not always agree with her take on Egypt and Arab-Israeli issues, but this is a fantastic book, and it really provides some insight into her husband, Anwar Sadat, as well. It's available on Amazon. I think you can get new or used copies, but I encourage you to read this book. All right, let's continue on now with our discussion of Egypt. Today, we're really going to focus on three of the iconic leaders of Egypt that defined the 20th century. We're going to revisit Gamal Abdel Nasser, and then we're also going to talk about Anwar Sadat and Hosni Mubarak specifically. So when we talk about Egypt, its history, its culture, and especially its role in the Arab world during and after the era of Gamal Abdel Nasser, we have to put it in context. If you want to understand the Middle East today, for instance, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the politics of the Arab world, the rise of pan-Arabism, the shifting alliances of the region, you have to be able to understand Egypt because it is at the center of this entire discussion. And to understand Egypt, you have to understand the people, or have some insight at least, into some of the people who made Egypt what it is today. And so we're going to talk about three of the iconic leaders of Egypt that really shaped the modern country. And the first of those is Gamal Abdel Nasser. As I said in the last episode, Egypt is the world's oldest continuous civilization. The Nile didn't just give life to the land, it shaped the people And for thousands of years, Egypt has been at a crossroads of an empire. Pharaonic, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Ottoman, British. Each one of these empires left their mark on what is now Egypt, and each shaped the Egyptian sense of self. But through it all, Egyptians held to a deep cultural continuity, a sense of rootedness in the Nile and the land, and the idea of Egypt as a civilization older than the empire itself. The Nile, for instance, as I said in the first episode, is more than just a river. It is a symbol of a people. It is a symbol of a country. It's something that is revered in Egyptian culture and has become one of the most discussed and iconic symbols of a society around the world. By the 19th and 20th centuries, Egypt was under British control. But as I said in the first episode, nationalism was rising, and it reached its peak in the 1950s. Egyptians wanted independence, they wanted dignity, they wanted control over their own destiny. This is the Egypt that produced what we talked about in the first episode, the free officers, and among them, a man named Gamal Abdel Nasser. We talked about Nasser a little bit in the first episode, but I want to dig into him a little bit more in this one as well. Nasser was born in 1918, the same year as my departed parents. He was the son of a postal worker. He grew up during a time when British soldiers patrolled Egyptian streets and Egyptian leaders answered to London. He saw humiliation, he saw inequality, he saw a nation yearning for dignity. In 1952, Nasser and the free officers overthrew King Farouk, as we discussed in the first episode, in a nearly bloodless coup. At first, Nasser stayed in the background, but by 1954, he emerged as Egypt's leader. And Nasser had a vision, a big vision. Nasser believed in Arab nationalism, anti-colonialism, state-led development, non-alignment, and Egypt as the leader of the Arab world. But he also believed in very tight control, a state economy, a socialistic approach to government. He wanted to modernize Egypt, free it from foreign control, and unite the Arab world under a shared identity. But a vision like that comes with consequences. What were some of those? Well, as we briefly touched on in the last episode, the Suez Crisis was one. This was, in some ways, Egypt's defining moment during that period of its history. In 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. This was a bold move that challenged the British and French control over one of the world's most important waterways. Britain, France, and Israel didn't take this lightly and launched a coordinated attack. Militarily, Egypt was outmatched. But geopolitically, Nasser was very shrewd, and he won the geopolitical part of the conflict. The United States and the Soviet Union, strangely enough, two very different philosophies as far as government and approach, but they were united in support for Egypt, but for different reasons. And both of these countries pressured the invaders, Britain, France, and Israel, to withdraw. For the first time in modern history, a Middle Eastern nation had stood up to European powers and survived, albeit with some help by two of the biggest superpowers on the planet. So Nasser became a hero across the Arab world. Cairo became the capital of Arab nationalism. Egypt became the beating heart of a new political identity. But the triumph carried seeds of future conflict. You see, Nasser believed that the Arab world was one people divided by colonial borders. He envisioned a united Arab nation, which was strong and independent and free of Western influence. And for a brief moment, it seemed possible. But as I said before in the previous episode, this idea of Arab unity fell apart very quickly. In 1958, Egypt and Syria formed the United Arab Republic. But it didn't last long. For different reasons, mostly political, economic, and power related, the union was fragile, and by 1961, Syria withdrew. Still, the idea of Arab unity remained powerful, and Nasser remained its champion. But the Arab-Israeli conflict would soon test that vision. The next challenge to Nasser's regime came in the form of the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War has almost risen to mythical proportions in a discussion of recent world history, especially in a discussion of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But for those of you who may not be aware, in 1967, tensions between Israel and Arab neighbors reached a breaking point. Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran, expelled UN peacekeepers, and mobilized troops into Sinai. Israel launched a preemptive strike. In 6 days, Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, Golan Heights, West Bank, and East Jerusalem, which was a devastating defeat for Egypt and the Arab world. But personally, for Nasser, it was a catastrophe, personal and political. He offered his resignation, but crowds filled the streets demanding that he stay. And he did stay. But he stayed under a cloud because the myth of Arab invincibility was shattered by the Six-Day War. Can you imagine Israel, one of the smallest countries in the world, in 6 days vanquished its enemies? In some ways, Nasser was never able to come back from that. In some ways, it damaged him, not just politically, but even more so psychologically, to the point where there was a fairly rapid decline. Gamal Abdel Nasser, this iconic figure who galvanized not only a country, but the Arab world, died in 1970 at just 52 years old. And he left a legacy that was very complicated. On one hand, he gave Egypt dignity and independence. He inspired anti-colonial movements worldwide. He modernized Egypt's infrastructure. He expanded education and healthcare. But on the other hand, he also centralized power, suppressed dissent, built a security state, left Egypt economically strained, and presided over one of the most devastating military defeats, not just in terms of Egypt, but really throughout history. Still, for millions, Nasser remained a symbol of pride, a leader who dared to dream big. Maybe his approach was wrong, but few could fault the vision that Nasser had for Egypt and for the Arab world. As Nasser faded off the scene with his death, a new galvanizing leader came onto the scene. After Nasser's death, Anwar Sadat took power. And Sadat changed everything. When you think about Anwar Sadat, and I've spent so much time reading about him, and I never met Anwar Sadat, but I spent so much time reading about him and talking with people who knew him personally, that if you characterize Sadat himself, it would be that he was a man of contradictions. He was the third president of Egypt, a man who ultimately reshaped the Middle East, a leader whose sole focus really was to build on what Nasser started and build it in a way that left Egypt stronger and more robust and better able to deal with geopolitical issues. Of course, Sadat is also a leader whose life ended in one of the most dramatic assassinations in modern history, which we will talk about. So, yes, Sadat was a man of contradictions. He was a revolutionary who became a statesman, a military man who won a war and then risked everything for peace, a nationalist who opened Egypt to the world, a hero to some, a traitor to others, a man who believed that destiny had chosen him, and he lived like it had. So it's good for us to walk through his life, his rise to power, the 1973 war, the peace with Israel, the domestic turmoil that followed, and the forces that ultimately led to his assassination. And during this discussion of Sadat, we'll explore the Egypt that he inherited, the Egypt he tried to build, and the Egypt he left behind. Sadat, like Nasser, was born in 1918 in Mit Abul al-Qam, a small village in the Nile Delta. He had a modest upbringing, rural and deeply Egyptian. He grew up surrounded by the rhythms of village life, the call to prayer, the fields, the river, the stories of ancient heroes and modern martyrs. But Sadat was not destined for a quiet life. As a young man, he was drawn to nationalist movements sweeping Egypt in the early 20th century. If you'll remember, the British still occupied the country until 1954. And resentment continued to shimmer everywhere. Sadat absorbed it all. He absorbed the humiliation, the anger, the longing for independence. So he joined secret political groups. He read voraciously. He read Gandhi. He read Hitler. He read Churchill. He read the Quran. He read the Bhagavad Gita. He believed in destiny, in signs, in the idea that history called certain men forward. And he had a very acute sense of destiny. He believed that he was the man who could lead Egypt into the modern age. In 1940s, Sadat joined the Free Officers Movement, which, as we discussed in the last episode, was a clandestine group of young military officers who were determined to overthrow the monarchy and end British influence. And of course, among them was this charismatic young officer that we've already talked about, named Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now, we need to understand the relationship between Sadat and Nasser. They were not close friends. Their approaches were very, very different. But they were bound by a shared mission, and that was to liberate Egypt. In 1952, the Free Officers launched a coup, as I said before, that toppled King Farouk. Egypt became a republic, and Nasser emerged as the dominant figure. Sadat, loyal and unthreatening, became one of Nasser's trusted lieutenants. He served in various roles during those years. He served as Minister of State, Speaker of Parliament, Vice President. He was often underestimated, even mocked by other officers who saw him as a lightweight. But Sadat didn't mind this because he had a different plan simmering under the surface. He understood something that all of his detractors didn't. And that is that being underestimated is a superpower. Sadat built a career, an iconic career, on succeeding through being underestimated. So during this time, Sadat remained loyal. He stayed quiet. He stayed patient. And when Nasser died suddenly in 1970, Sadat, the man no one feared, became president of Egypt. And quite frankly, the reason that he likely became president of Egypt is because no one feared him. He didn't have the baggage that others had. They thought they could control Sadat. But those who thought that didn't really understand the kind of man that Anwar Sadat was. They expected him to be a placeholder until someone more charismatic stepped forward. But they were wrong. Within a year of taking office, Sadat stunned Egypt's political elite. How? He did it by purging Nasser's loyalists. He arrested rivals. He consolidated power with surgical precision. Remember, Sadat was no big fan of Nasser. In many ways, their philosophies were in total conflict with each other. But he stayed quiet, he stayed loyal, he stayed behind the scenes. And then, after taking power, he remained consistent for the first year, not ruffling feathers. And then he struck with surgical precision and purged the government of Nasser's loyalists. This period became known as the Corrective Revolution. Sadat's declaration that he, not Nasser, was in control of the country. He wasn't Nasser's shadow, pardon me, but rather he was his own man. He shifted Egypt's alliances away from the Soviet Union and toward the United States. Nasser was a socialist, so he was very much pro-Soviet. Not the case with Sadat. Sadat also opened Egypt's economy to foreign investment. He loosened some of the state controls that had defined Nasser's era. But Sadat knew that none of this mattered if he didn't address the wound that defined Egyptian identity after 1967. Remember that Six-Day War? Well, during the Six-Day War, Egypt lost the Sinai to Israel. And Sadat knew that that was the elephant in the room. That's what had to be addressed. So by 1973, Egypt was exhausted, economically, emotionally, spiritually. The defeat in the Six-Day War had shattered their national pride. And Sadat understood that Egypt needed a victory, not necessarily a military one, but they certainly needed a psychological one. So he planned a bold, limited war. On October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal, overwhelmed Israeli defenses, and reclaimed a foothold in Sinai. It stunned the world. For the first time in decades, Egypt felt pride again. Now remember, this was a time when Golda Meir was the leader of Israel, and there's a very excellent movie called Golda, that deals with this period of how Golda Meir and her government responded to the Yom Kippur War and this incursion by the Egyptians. The war didn't end in total victory. Israel counterattacked. Superpowers intervened. A ceasefire was negotiated. But for Egyptians, the message was clear. We are not defeated. We're not broken. We're still Egypt. And this man that everyone had underestimated, this man that had bided his time for so long, this man that had ignored the insults and quietly built a power base while being subjugated to Nasser, suddenly became a hero. And with that restored honor, he turned toward a goal no other Arab leader had dared to pursue. In 1977, Sadat made one of the most shocking moves in modern Middle Eastern history. He flew to Jerusalem. He spoke before the Israeli Knesset. He declared that the time had come for peace. This was an earthquake in the Arab world. Not just that he did it, but that he had the audacity to go onto the land of his enemies and make the bold statement that we are ready for peace. Remember in 1973, Yom Kippur, he proved that he was ready for war. Now, later, he proved he was ready for peace. The Arab world erupted. Some called him brave, but many called him a traitor. But Sadat believed that peace was the only path forward for Egypt's economy, for its future, for its children. And this led, of course, to the famous Camp David Accords, which were brokered by U.S. President Jimmy Carter. During the Camp David Accords, or as part of the Camp David Accords, Egypt regained the Sinai. Diplomatic relations were established, and a peace treaty was signed. For this, Sadat won the Nobel Peace Prize. But at home, it created a lot of backlash. While governments all over the world applauded Sadat for his courage, there were severe ramifications to be faced, both within Egypt and throughout the Middle East. Islamist groups accused him of betraying the Arab cause. Leftists accused him of selling out the West, or selling out to the West, rather. And the economy struggled under his reforms. Political repression increased. Sadat had made peace abroad, but unrest was building at home. Some Arab leaders said that Sadat had made a deal with what they considered to be the devil, and he was going to pay a very high price for that. Remember, in 1973, Sadat had had the audacity to invade what was Israeli-controlled territory on Yom Kippur. In 1977, he had the audacity to pursue the Camp David Accords. And in 1981, everything culminated in a toxic cocktail that led to his assassination. On October 6th of that year, 1981, which was the anniversary of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Sadat presided over a military parade in Cairo. As jets roared overhead and soldiers marched past the reviewing stand, a group of militants broke ranks, approached the platform, and opened fire. Sadat was killed instantly. The man who believed in destiny, and specifically that he had been chosen to lead Egypt, died in a moment of violent spectacle broadcast to the entire world. His death shocked Egypt. It shocked the region. It shocked everyone who followed Middle Eastern affairs. But it was also the culmination of forces he had unleashed, the boldness, the risk, the enemies he made, the peace he pursued. This book, as I told you before, A Woman of Egypt, by his wife, Jahan Sadat, the first chapter in this book deals with the day of his assassination. It is one of the most gripping narratives that I've read. It was supposed to be a great day, a day where they were celebrating the Yom Kippur War, where this man that had been so misunderstood and so maligned had become a hero in the Arab world. And yet that beautiful day in Cairo, which should have been a celebration, turned out to be a tragedy, not just for the Sadat family, but for Egypt and ultimately for the wider Arab world. So what's Sadat's legacy? How do we remember him? Well, to some, he's the man who restored Egyptian pride in 1973. To others, he's a visionary who made peace possible. But to many in the Arab world, he remains a controversial figure, a leader who broke ranks and paid the price. But no matter where one stands on this issue, Sadat was a man of immense courage. He dared to do what others feared. He believed in destiny. He lived like a man that was racing toward it. He changed Egypt. He changed the Middle East. He changed history. And in the end, he proved something profound. And what was that? Namely, that peace can be as dangerous as war, and sometimes even more costly. That was Anwar Sadat, the man filled with contradictions, the man who overcame all the obstacles, all of the criticism, to become a hero to many and a villain to many others. Who came after him? Well, after an interim president, Hosni Mubarak took control of the Egyptian government. And Mubarak ruled Egypt for nearly 30 years. If you look at Mubarak's reign as president, and reign is the wrong word, his time as president, reign sounds like he was a king. He was not. Although he acted like it at some times. But if you look at his era, it was defined by stability, but also by authoritarianism, economic stagnation. He continued to have a strong relationship with the United States, but he was much more cautious to Israel than Sadat had been. If you look at Mubarak, we talked about Sadat as being a man of contradiction. Well, Mubarak was really a survivor. But ultimately, if you look at the sum total of Mubarak's reign, Mubarak can be categorized as the man who stayed too long. I've seen in country after country in my work around the world, very good leaders who tried to do the right thing, but ultimately just stayed too long. Mikhail Saakashvili in Georgia is one of these. His first term as president of Georgia was after the Rose Revolution deposed Eduard Shevardnadze, was an unbelievable success. His second term was an unmitigated disaster because he stayed too long. This has happened time after time, and it certainly happened to Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak was Egypt's fourth president. He took control of the country at a time when they were still very much stinging from Anwar Sadat's assassination. And during his 30 years as president, he reshaped the Middle East. Mubarak is a study in contrast. He was a war hero that became a symbol of stagnation, a stabilizer who became synonymous with repression, a leader of Egypt out of war and out of progress, a man who survived assassination attempts, regional upheavals, political storms, until he couldn't survive ultimately the one thing that led to the toppling of his government, and that was the Egyptian people themselves. So let's briefly walk through Mubarak's rise, his long presidency, and the forces that sustained him, as well as the pressures that broke him and the legacy he left behind. And by the way, it's a legacy that's still debated and still unresolved. Mubarak was born 10 years later than Nasser and Sadat. He was born in 1928 in Kafr el-Mislah, a small village in the Nile Delta. Again, his upbringing, like Nasser and Sadat, was modest, but it was disciplined. Unlike Sadat especially, Mubarak was not a dreamer, and he wasn't a philosopher like Nasser. He was practical, methodical, intensely focused. He joined the Egyptian Military Academy, then the Air Force Academy, where he excelled. Mubarak rose quickly through the ranks. He became a pilot, then an instructor, then a commander. And he was known for his precision, his loyalty, and his almost emotionless calm. During Sadat's 1973 Yom Kippur War, Mubarak served as the commander of the Egyptian Air Force. Under his leadership, Egypt launched a successful surprise attack that helped restore national pride. It earned him the trust of President Sadat and set the stage for his rise on the political stage. In 1975, Sadat appointed him as vice president. And in 1981, after Sadat's assassination, Mubarak became president of Egypt. He inherited, quite frankly, a mess. A nation in turmoil. It was economically strained, politically fractured, and because of Sadat's assassination, emotionally raw. And so Mubarak promised the one thing that the Egyptian people really galvanized around, and that was stability. Mubarak's first years in office were marked with caution. Remember, he's not this dreamer. He's not a philosopher. He's slow and steady. And that's exactly what he did in his first years. He moved slowly. He moved deliberately. He avoided the dramatic gestures that defined Sadat. Remember, just a year into his reign, Sadat replaced all of Nasser's government. Not so with Mubarak. He took it slow and easy. He released some political prisoners. He eased tensions with the opposition. He focused on rebuilding the economy. He knew that Egyptians who were exhausted by war and upheaval really wanted a period of calm. And that's what he gave them. Mubarak cultivated an image of a steady hand, the pilot guiding a nation through turbulence. He avoided ideology. He avoided risk. He avoided change that might threaten his position. He slowly, quietly consolidated power. The emergency law that had been put in place under Sadat remained in place. Opposition parties were tolerated but constrained. The security services grew stronger. But during this period of calm on the outside, underneath, the seeds of corruption were being sown, and they were sown so deeply during this period that they became endemic to the state. Mubarak's Egypt became predictable, but unfortunately, it was predictably stagnant. If Mubarak had a strength, it was in foreign policy. He positioned Egypt as a regional stabilizer, a mediator, a partner the world could rely on. He maintained the peace with Israel, a peace many Egyptians disliked, but one that Mubarak saw as essential. He strengthened ties with the United States, securing billions of dollars in military and economic aid. He kept relations with Arab states steady, even when regional politics shifted dramatically. I did projects in Egypt during the latter part of Mubarak's reign. And his Egypt adopted his own personality. It grew, it was stabilized, it developed relationships, but it did so very strategically, very slowly, because that was Mubarak's style. During the Gulf War in 1991, Mubarak supported the U.S.-led coalition in Iraq. This decision brought Egypt debt relief and a lot of international favor, which is why many of us ended up in Egypt later on, supporting them through USAID and State Department projects. But his support for the United States in the Gulf War also generated criticism from those who saw his policies as aligning too closely with the West. Egypt has always been in this three-way conundrum where you had the United States on one side, you had Russia on one side, on another side, and then you had the Arab world on the other side. And their different philosophies, their different approaches often conflicted. And Mubarak was really in the center of this. But even so, Mubarak's foreign policy kept Egypt influential, at least on the world stage. But at home, cracks began to show. In the 1980s and 1990s, Islamic militancy began to rise. Groups like Gamal al-Islam launched attacks across Egypt, targeting officials, tourists, and civilians. How did Mubarak respond? With overwhelming force. Remember, stability was very important to Mubarak. And anything that undercut that stability, he was going to take quick action to address. And he certainly did that with these militancy groups. His police and army made mass arrests, military trials. He expanded police powers. He created a security state that touched every corner of Egyptian life in the name of keeping people safe. The violence eventually subsided, but the cost was very high. Egypt became a place where fear lived just beneath the surface. Because when the Islamic insurgency went away, the security apparatus did not. And it turned its attention on average Egyptians. Meanwhile, the economy struggled and unemployment rose, inequality deepened. Corruption flourished. Crony capitalism enriched a small elite, mostly connected to Mubarak, while millions fell behind. By the early 2000s, Mubarak's rule felt less like stability and more like stagnation. And that's exactly the way it felt during my initial work there. And then came the question that everyone whispered. Who comes after Mubarak? He was aging. He had no vice president, and rumors swirled that he planned to hand power over to his son, Gamal, who was, let's just say, not respected throughout most of Egypt. In fact, even the thought that Mubarak would hand the government over to his son, for most Egyptians, became the breaking point. So by the late 2000s, Egypt was simmering. Young people faced bleak job prospects. Police brutality was rampant. Corruption was everywhere. Elections were a formality. The emergency law had been in place now for decades. Civil society began to push back. This was the rise of social media, and bloggers began to get involved. Activists began on the rise. Labor unions began to form. The Kafaya movement surfaced, as did the April 6th youth movement. The spark came in 2011 when protests in Tunisia toppled President Ben Ali. This was called Arab Spring. And we'll talk more about Ben Ali when we talk about Tunisia, but this was a seminal event when one dissenter in Tunisia that immolated himself, set himself on fire, led to this groundswell that became Arab Spring that toppled Ben Ali and other North African and Arab leaders. Up until that time, what to do with Mubarak had been really conjecture because he was so strong, his security apparatus was so strong, even the opposition groups really couldn't understand how he could be dislodged. But after Arab Spring, Egyptians took to the streets. Tahrir Square, a place where I have a lot of memories, filled with hundreds of thousands of people. Muslims and Christians stood side by side, old and young, rich and poor, all demanding one thing. Mubarak has to go. We don't want Hosni Mubarak anymore, and we certainly don't want his son, Gamal. For the first time in his life, Mubarak faced a force he could not control. He had stamped out the radical Islamist. He had survived all of the other conflicts that had come his way, but he couldn't survive the collective force of the Egyptian people. And so this led to what's now called the 18 days that changed everything. In 2011, this groundswell began to occur in Egypt as well. Protests grew. The world watched. Security forces cracked down. The people pushed back. In the past, when security forces had cracked down, the opposition had been scattered. Not this time. All the crackdown did was galvanize the population against the regime. Mubarak tried everything. He reshuffled his government. He promised reforms. He appointed a new vice president. He insisted he would not run again. But it was too late. On February 11th, 2011, after 18 days of mass protest, Mubarak resigned. Egypt erupted in celebration. The man who had ruled for 30 years was gone. Now, here's the interesting thing. By this time, Mubarak was widely vilified in Egypt, and he was, in some cases, a very scary individual. His security apparatus especially was. And his son Gamal had oversized power, and even the thought, as I said, of him becoming president was onerous to many. And yet, he had always supported the United States, and the United States had always supported him. My first projects in Egypt occurred during this period and then shortly after Mubarak's reign. And it was a very weird dichotomy because on one hand, those of us on the ground in Egypt could see what was happening. We could see the inequality. We could see the fear. We could see the conflict. And yet our government was supporting the man who was perpetuating it. Diplomacy is not easy. And sometimes there are no good guys and bad guys. There are only just variations of bad guys. And Mubarak might have been a bad guy, but he was our bad guy. And so as Mubarak was unraveling, there were many within the United States government that were asking themselves, okay, what comes next? And what does this mean for U.S. diplomacy? So Mubarak resigned on February 11, 2011. He was gone. For many, it felt like a new dawn. For others, it felt like stepping into the unknown. For Mubarak, it was the end of an era. And not only that, but it was the beginning of a long and humiliating chapter of his life. You see, after his fall, Mubarak faced charges of corruption and complicity in the killing of protesters. He appeared in court on a hospital bed, a frail figure who once commanded a nation. He was convicted, then acquitted, then retried, and it was a legal saga that reflected Egypt's own turmoil. Mubarak spent his final years largely out of the public eye. He died in 2020 at the age of 91 years old, and his legacy remains deeply contested. To some, he was a stabilizer who kept Egypt out of war. To others, he was a dictator who suffocated the people's potential. To many, he was simply a man who stayed too long. And I think I fall in that third camp. I feel like that his vision, if you can call it that, for Egypt, although typically when you talk about vision, you talk more about Nasser and Sadat, but his, at least Mubarak's approach might have made total sense to him and might have accomplished the goals that he wanted to accomplish. And for the first half to 2/3 of his presidency, the Egyptian people were willing to tolerate it. But when it became clear that he refused to give up power, or when he did give up power, it was going to go to someone that Egyptians felt even more as onerous or even more onerous, he simply stayed too long. The sad and tragic chapter of Mubarak's life might never have happened if he had simply stepped down earlier. So how do we understand Mubarak today? Well, there's a lot of unknowns. There's a lot of conjecture. What we know, though, is he was not a visionary like Nasser. He was not a risk taker like Sadat. He was a manager, a caretaker, a man who believed stability was the highest good. But stability without progress comes stagnation, and stagnation breeds frustration, and frustration breeds revolution, and that's exactly what happened to Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak's Egypt was a place of contradictions. It was modern yet corrupt, stable yet brittle, powerful yet hollow. And Mubarak's fall revealed a long hidden truth: that a nation and a people can endure repression for decades until one day it can't, or one day it won't. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Hosni Mubarak. He was a strong man that nobody could depose until he wasn't. And all the potential assassinations, military coups, everything else had failed. It was ultimately the Egyptian people that said, we've had enough, and Mubarak has to go. And that's what occurred. So what came next? Well, Egypt today is still a key U.S. ally. It's a mediator of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's a cultural powerhouse. It's a nation that balances tradition, modernity, and regional ambition. In the years after Mubarak, when I was still involved in projects there, you could see the shift. Now there was, I will readily state, after Mubarak, after this period of euphoria when Mubarak was gone, reality set in. And the Egyptian population began to realize that things were not going to change quickly, that this security apparatus that they feared wasn't going to be dismantled overnight, that their economy wasn't going to grow overnight, but slow and steady, they especially built an economy that is that is an example of progress throughout the Arab world. So why does Egypt matter? Well, it matters because it's the most populous Arab country. It controls the Suez Canal. It has cultural influence across the Arab world. It has historically led Arab political movements, and it continues to play, a central role in Israel-Palestinian diplomacy. You can't understand the Middle East, as I said before, unless you understand Egypt. And that's why when we talk about Islam's fault line, these tectonic plates that beat against each other, that create the fissures within the Arab world, Egypt is certainly at the nexus of that. Egypt's story is one of resilience, reinvention, and identity. From the Nile to Nasser, from empire to independence, from war to diplomacy, Egypt has shaped the region in a way few nations ever have. I hope that you've enjoyed these two episodes on Egypt. I think that you, at a very minimum, hopefully, learned some things that you didn't know, not only about the country, but about the men who led the country. And I hope that you will continue to join us here on this podcast, Some Stops Along the Way, every Monday at 8 a.m. And we're starting a new country next time, a new North African country. I think you'll be very interested, and I hope you will be there for it. Like and subscribe on Facebook and Spotify, and we'll see you next time on Some Stops Along the Way.